Today, we're basically becoming historical detectives. And our main suspect? The Rigveda, one of the oldest texts in the entire world. We're going to figure out how historians take this ancient collection of poems and use it to piece together a picture of life from over 3,500 years ago. So, let's start digging.
And right away, we hit our first major puzzle. The Rigveda, this thing we call a book, existed for centuries, maybe even 1,000 years, without ever being written down. It was all passed on through word of mouth. It lived entirely in people's minds and voices. So how on earth do you even begin to study something like that?
Well, we start right here with our first piece of hard evidence. Just look at this. This is a fragile page from a Rigveda manuscript, written on birch bark that was found in Kashmir. It's ancient, and it represents a huge moment in history. It's the point where a world of pure sound became a physical object we can actually hold and study. In fact, this very manuscript, which was found about 150 years ago, was the one used to print one of the very first versions of the text.
And that's what makes this piece of bark so mind-blowing. Think about it. Before this, the entire Rigveda, and we're talking over 1,000 hymns, was passed down perfectly, from teacher to student, generation after generation. It was literally a library carried inside people's heads. Just an incredible feat of memory.
So, how do historians start cracking this case? Well, our first big clue is hidden in plain sight. It's the language itself. The words of the Rigveda hold a kind of secret code that connects its ancient world to ours, in ways you might not expect.
To really get the Rigveda's language, you first got to appreciate that the Indian subcontinent is this incredible crossroads of languages. It's not just one big group. You've got the Tibeto-Burman family up in the northeast, the Dravidian family like Tamil and Telugu down south, and the Austroasiatic family in central India. But the Rigveda, it belongs to a totally different group.
The language of these hymns is Sanskrit. And the really fascinating thing is that Sanskrit is part of this massive family tree of languages called Indo-European. This group is just huge. It includes most languages in Europe, many in Asia like Persian, and of course a ton of modern Indian languages like Hindi, Gujarati, and Assamese. And you can actually see the family resemblance so clearly right here. Take the word for mother. In Sanskrit, it's matra. In Hindi, it's ma. And in English, it's mother. You can hear that connection, right? It's like linguistic DNA. And it tells historians that all these languages, spoken thousands of miles apart, probably share a common ancestor. It's a huge clue about how people and their ideas moved across continents ages ago.
Okay, so we've got the language clue. Now for clue number 2. How did this ancient oral tradition, just sound and memory, finally become that physical object we saw, a manuscript we can actually read and study?
This timeline really shows you what an incredible journey this text has had. It was first composed over 3,500 years ago, and for ages it was only spoken. Centuries went by before anyone wrote it down. And it wasn't until about 150 years ago that birch bark manuscript from Kashmir helped create a printed version. Today, that text is carefully preserved in a library in Pune. What an epic trip, huh? From breath to book.
All right, we've looked at the language and the physical text. Now let's do what historians do and dive right into the hymns themselves. Because these aren't just prayers, they're stories, they're descriptions, and they are packed with clues. We're going to look at one specific hymn that's really special because it's actually a conversation. It's a dialogue between a wise sage, a man named Vishvamitra, and two rivers, the Bias and the Sutlej. And the key thing here is that the hymn doesn't treat them like just water. It treats them like powerful goddesses.
Just listen to how Vishvamitra talks to them. Come down from the mountains like two swift horses, like two shining cows that lick their calves. The imagery there is so revealing, isn't it? He's comparing the powerful rivers to the two most important animals in their world, fast horses for battle and precious, life-giving cows.
And then the rivers answer him. They say, "We will listen to your prayers so that you can cross safely." I mean, just think about that. The rivers are actual characters in this drama. They're intelligent beings who can hear a prayer and grant safe passage for the sage's chariots and carts. So, what can we figure out from just these few lines? Well, 1, rivers were worshipped as goddesses. 2, horses and cows were a huge deal. 3, they used chariots and carts. And 4, just by process of elimination, we know the people who wrote this hymn lived somewhere near where the Bias and Sutlej rivers flow. It's like a perfect little historical snapshot captured in a poem. So, when historians piece together hundreds of little clues just like that one from all across the Rigveda, they can start to build a really detailed profile of this ancient world. Let's take a look at what that picture starts to look like.
When you analyze all the prayers, you start to see their priorities pretty clearly. They prayed for cattle, they prayed for horses to pull their war chariots, and they prayed for children, especially for sons. And what did they fight over? The hymns are clear about that too. Battles were fought for the basics, land for their animals to graze on, water, and sometimes to capture people. The hymns also tell us about the people. First, you have the Brahmins, the priests. These were the spiritual experts, the ones who performed all the important rituals and sacrifices. And as payment for their work, they often got a cut of the wealth that was won in battle.
And then you had the leaders, called Rajas. But, and this is important, these guys weren't like the kings we think of today. They didn't have big capital cities or palaces or giant armies just waiting around. They didn't collect regular taxes from everyone. A Raja was a leader, probably chosen because he was brave and a good warrior who led his people when it was time to fight.
The Rigveda also draws a pretty clear line between two groups of people. The people who wrote the hymns called themselves the Aryas, and they described their rivals as the Dasas or Dasyus. The big differences they pointed out were that the Dasas didn't perform the same sacrifices, and, critically, they spoke different languages. This was a really important distinction for them.
So, after we've looked at the language, the manuscript, and the stories inside the poems, what's the final verdict? What have our historical detectives figured out? Let's pull it all together.
Well, the verdict is pretty clear. The Rigveda is so much more than just a religious book. It's a time capsule. It's this incredibly detailed, living window that lets us look directly into the world of the people who created it. We get to see what they cared about, how they viewed the world, who they fought, and what they prayed for.
And that leaves us with one last thing to think about. The Rigveda only survived because of this unbelievable centuries-long commitment to memory. So what about our world today? If our most important stories, our science, our art, our history, were only spoken, never written down, what little pieces would future historians be able to find? And maybe more importantly, what would be lost forever?
Welcome. Today, we're going to be historical detectives. Our entire investigation is about piecing together a society from 3,500 years ago, and we've only got one major piece of evidence to work with, their sacred songs. So let's see what secrets they're hiding. So here's the big puzzle we're up against. Just think about it. How do you possibly understand a civilization when you don't have the usual clues? No grand ruins of palaces, no buried legal codes, no tax records, nothing. Where do you even start?
Well, you start with their words. What you're looking at here is a page from the Rigveda, which is this incredible collection of hymns and prayers. You have to think of it less like a book and more like an archaeological site made of language. Every single word is a potential artifact, a clue that can tell us who these people were and what really mattered to them.
Okay, so first step in our investigation, we need to figure out their core values. And probably the best way to do that is to see what they were constantly asking their gods for in all these prayers.
And we have a ton of data to work with. I mean, the Rigveda isn't just a few poems here and there. It's a huge collection, over 1,000 hymns. That kind of volume lets us spot some really clear patterns in what they hoped for, what they were scared of, and what they wanted most. So, let's put on our detective hats for a second. If you're sifting through thousands of prayers from one group of people, what do you think they're going to ask for again and again? What do you think they wanted more than anything else in the world?
Well, the answer is remarkably consistent. Their wish list, if you want to call it that, really focused on three things. Cattle, which was their main way of measuring wealth, horses, which were like the high-tech engines of power and technology, and children, especially sons, to carry on their family line. You know, this wasn't a society praying for gold or giant jewels. They valued living, breathing, productive things.
Now, let's zoom in on the horses. They weren't just praying for them because they looked cool. Horses were the high-tech military hardware of their day, and they were absolutely essential for a huge part of Rigvedic life, warfare.
The hymns paint a really vivid picture here. Conflict wasn't some rare event or a terrible disaster. It was just a constant feature of their world. It was the engine that drove their economy, shaped their leadership, and pretty much their whole view of life.
So what was all this fighting about? Well, it's a direct reflection of what they valued most. They fought for land so their cattle could graze, they fought for control of rivers and water, and they fought to capture more wealth. And that wealth came in the form of both cattle and people. This is the key takeaway. For this society, war was the economy.
And what's so fascinating is that we actually have archaeological evidence that backs all of this up.
You can see their primary weapons here, an iron axe and dagger, and there's also horse equipment that's been found in ancient burials, which just goes to show how vital these animals were. This physical evidence, it makes it all real. These are the actual tools that powered their society and their battles.
Okay, so a battle is won. You've captured cattle, goods, even people. What happens next? Does the leader just get to keep everything? Well, not exactly. They had a really specific system for sharing the spoils.
This flowchart breaks it down perfectly. So first, the leader gets his share. Then, the priests, who are called Brahmins, they get a portion for handling all the religious rituals. But here's the crucial part. The rest of it was distributed among the people. And then, a final piece was offered back to the gods in sacrifices, or yajnas, which kind of completed the whole cycle. It was a system built on sharing, not just hoarding at the top.
And this whole system of sharing leads us right to the leaders themselves. The hymns call them rajas, but as we're about to see, that word did not mean what we might think it means. You kind of have to forget your typical idea of a king.
So get this, the position of Raja wasn't hereditary. A son didn't automatically become the leader just because his dad was. Nope. Leaders were chosen. They were picked by the community, usually in these big assemblies, based on one main qualification: being a brave and skillful warrior. It was basically a meritocracy of the battlefield. This slide right here, this is the real aha moment. Just look at the comparison. On one side, you have the Rigvedic Raja, chosen for his skill, no palace or capital city, no standing army, and, this is huge, no power to collect regular taxes. His authority came from the people. Now compare that to our typical idea of a king. It's a completely different way of thinking about leadership.
So, we've got a handle on their values, their economy, their leaders. But how did they see themselves compared to others? You know, the us versus them. Well, the hymns draw some pretty clear lines in the sand.
The people who wrote these hymns, they called themselves the Aryas, and their opponents, the people they fought against, they called them the Dasas or Dasyus. These weren't just random names. They represented a really fundamental social and cultural divide.
So what defined this divide? This quote from the source gets right to the heart of it. The Dasyus were seen as outsiders mainly because they didn't perform the same religious sacrifices and they spoke different languages. This is so important. The main distinction was cultural and religious based on what you did and how you spoke, not necessarily how you looked.
And here we see a really crucial shift, both in language and in society. Over time, that word dasa, which started out just meaning opponent or enemy, it evolved. It came to mean slave. These were the men and women who were captured in war, who were then treated as the property of their owners. The other in battle became property in peacetime.
Okay, let's pull back and put all these puzzle pieces together. When we read these hymns, not just as prayers, but as a historical document, what kind of society do they show us?
So this is the final portrait. The hymns reveal a pastoral, semi-nomadic people whose wealth was literally on the hoof. Their politics were communal, led by warrior chiefs they chose themselves, not by kings who inherited the throne. They didn't have the big state structures we usually associate with ancient civilizations, like tax collectors and palaces. It was a society really organized around three things: the clan, the herd, and the battle.
And all of this leaves us with one last thought. The Rigveda gives us this clear window into a world with a totally different value system. For them, wealth was cattle and power was bravery. And it kind of forces us to ask ourselves, if historians 3,500 years from now were analyzing our digital hymns, our social media, our news, our art, what would they say are our ultimate measures of wealth and power? What does our world truly value?
All across ancient India, you can find these incredible silent stone structures. They've been standing guard for thousands of years. They're tombs, they're monuments, but most of all, they're puzzles. They were left behind by a people who had no written history, so their entire story, well, it's told through stone. So let's dive in and see if we can uncover the secrets of these ancient megaliths.
Just think about it. For 3,000 years, these stones have kept their secrets totally locked away. But, you know, modern archaeology has finally given us a key. It is absolutely time to unlock these ancient tombs and start piecing together the lives of the people who built them. Okay, so first things first. Before we can even begin to understand their secrets, we need to get a handle on what these monuments actually are. Our investigation starts right here by identifying these silent sentinels.
So when you look at these, what are you actually seeing? Are they temples, maybe old forts, or something else entirely? Well, the answer's kind of hiding in their name, and definitely in their purpose.
They're called megaliths, and the name is super straightforward.
It literally means big stones, and that's exactly what they are. But these aren't just random piles of rock. Not at all. They were massive boulders, carefully arranged by people to mark burial sites. You can almost think of them as ancient, monumental tombstones.
And this wasn't just some local custom either. This practice of building megaliths, it started about 3,000 years ago, and it was incredibly widespread. I mean, we find them all over, from the Deccan Plateau, all through South India, and even as far out as the Northeast and up in Kashmir. This was a huge shared cultural tradition that spanned the subcontinent.
All right, so now that we've got the what and the where figured out, it's time to get to the how. Let's step inside these stone circles and see how they were actually built and what secrets they were designed to protect.
You have to imagine building one of these was a massive undertaking, especially 3,000 years ago without modern tech. It involved a pretty clear step-by-step process. First, you're digging these huge pits. Then comes the really hard part, transporting and breaking these enormous boulders. After all that, you have to carefully place the stones in just the right position, and finally you bury the dead within the structure you've just created.
But here's a little twist. Not all megaliths look the same. Some are really obvious, with these giant stone circles you can see right on the surface. But in other cases, the stones were just acting as a kind of signpost, marking a burial that was hidden deep underground.
So the big question is, what did archaeologists find when they finally looked inside? Well, alongside the skeletons, they found all sorts of objects buried with the dead. Things like distinctive black and red ware pots, but also tools and weapons of iron. We're talking axes and daggers. They even found horse equipment and, get this, the actual skeletons of horses.
Now these objects are so much more than just old artifacts. They are vital clues. Because the real story isn't just about who died, it's about what they were buried with. When you analyze the skeletons alongside these grave goods, it reveals a whole lot about the society that left them behind.
And all these grave goods bring up a really crucial question. You know, if you were a person living 3,000 years ago, would your burial look the same as your neighbors? Was everyone treated equally, even in death?
The answer to that is a resounding no. Not even close. At a site called Brahmagiri, for instance, archaeologists found a really stark difference. Most skeletons, they were buried with just a few simple pots. But one individual, this person was found with an incredible collection of valuables. 33 gold beads, stone beads, 4 copper bangles, and even a conch shell.
Let that just sink in for a second. 33 gold beads. That is not just a little token of remembrance. That is a serious display of wealth and status. It immediately tells you this person was very, very different.
The conclusion here was pretty much inescapable. As the archaeologists themselves put it, these finds point to a clear difference in status. This wasn't some equal society. There were rich people and poor people, chiefs and followers.
But social status wasn't the only secret these tombs gave up. They also had something really interesting to tell us about another fundamental part of society: family. So archaeologists started noticing that some of these megaliths had more than one skeleton inside, which suggested they weren't just single-use tombs. And the key piece of evidence was the discovery of portholes. These were basically small openings that would have allowed people to place the remains of other family members inside, maybe years or decades later. They were, for all intents and purposes, ancient family vaults.
So, as we start to wrap up our investigation, let's take one last look at the legacy these people left for us. A legacy written not in ink, but carved in stone.
So what have these silent sentinels actually told us? Well, we've learned that they were elaborate tombs, way more than just simple graves. They've given us this clear window into a society that had real social differences with chiefs and followers. They show pretty clear evidence of family burial plots that were used over generations. And they acted as permanent signposts, making sure that future generations could find and honor the burial sites of their ancestors.
The people who built these megaliths, they left behind no books, no scrolls, only bones and stones. Everything we know about them comes from the careful study of these silent clues. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? As archaeologists continue to dig, what other secrets about our ancient past are still just waiting to be unearthed?
All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're basically becoming archaeological detectives, and we're tackling a very, very cold case. We're going to be piecing together clues from thousands of years ago to figure out, how did these people live, what was important to them, and how did they honor their dead?
So how do you solve a mystery that's 3,000 years old? I mean, seriously, think about it. There are no modern records, no photos, no diaries. Where do you even start?
Well, that's exactly what we're going to get into today. The methods, the real detective work that historians and archaeologists use to put these ancient puzzles back together.
Okay, so our investigation is going to kick off with two main types of clues. First, you've got the stories people actually wrote down, ancient books. And second, you've got the physical stuff they left behind, buried in the ground. It's kind of like combining literature with a crime scene investigation.
So on one hand, you've got the written word, which is almost like having eyewitness accounts from the past, and on the other, you have what's literally buried beneath our feet, the stone structures, the tools, the burials. Each one gives us a completely different piece of the puzzle.
All right, let's start with our first piece of evidence, the eyewitness testimony, if you will. We're diving into one of the oldest books in the world, the Rigveda. This thing was first put together more than 3,500 years ago. So it's basically a direct window into the minds of these ancient people, what they were thinking, what they were praying for.
But here's the really wild part. The Rigveda wasn't originally a book at all. For hundreds and hundreds of years, it was an oral tradition. People just recited it and memorized it, passing it down from generation to generation. It was only much, much later that it was finally written down on manuscripts like the one you see here.
And this text, it's just packed with hymns and prayers. You get things like this incredible dialogue between a sage named Vishvamitra and two rivers, the Bias and the Sutlej. And get this, the rivers were worshipped as goddesses. It just goes to show you, they lived in a world where nature wasn't just scenery, it was alive, it was divine, and you could talk to.
So what do these prayers tell us? Well, they give us a really clear snapshot of what was important to these people. They prayed for cattle and horses, which was their wealth, right? And they wanted those horses for their chariots in battle. We also learn about their leaders, these guys called Rajas. But don't think of them as kings sitting on thrones in big palaces. No, these Rajas were skilled, respected warriors.
Okay, but what about all the stories that weren't written down? What about the everyday people? For that, we literally have to dig. So let's shift gears and look at our next set of clues, these silent stone sentinels that show us where to find ancient burials. These huge stone structures have a name. They're called megaliths, which literally just means big stone. And they're basically giant ancient tombstones. People started building them about 3,000 years ago, all across places like the Deccan, South India, the Northeast, and Kashmir. They're like giant road signs pointing archaeologists to exactly where the dead were buried.
And you know, building one of these things was no small task. It was a massive community effort. You had to dig these huge pits, transport gigantic stones, we're talking serious heavy lifting, and then carefully place them in just the right position. It was this huge, coordinated project, all to honor the people who had died.
Now, when archaeologists look inside these stone tombs, sometimes they're called cysts. They find a lot more than just skeletons. They find all sorts of objects buried right there with the dead. Things like tools, weapons, pottery, basically anything they thought a person might need in the afterlife.
And the range of these, grave goods is pretty amazing. You find everything from distinctive black and red ware pots to iron weapons and even skeletons of horses. Sometimes you find beautiful ornaments made of stone and gold. This tells us two really important things. One, they probably believed in an afterlife. And two, it points to social status. I mean, some people were buried with tons of gold and treasure, while others just had a few simple pots.
Okay, so now let's bring it all together. We're going to zoom in on one specific crime scene, if you will, a place called Indo-European. This is where all these different clues, the burials, the objects, the way people lived, really start to paint a picture. This is the heart of our cold case, and it's all about life and death here 3,000 years ago.
And this place, Indo-European, it wasn't just some temporary camp. It was a living, breathing town on the river Gode for almost 1,000 years, starting around 3,600 years ago. So the burials found here give us these incredible, one-of-a-kind insights into how these people actually lived and died over a really long time.
So archaeologists were digging here and they found something really weird. See, most adults were just buried in the ground, laid out straight. But they found one man who was placed inside a massive, four-legged clay jar. And not just anywhere, but in the courtyard of a big 5-room house. This was definitely not your standard burial.
And the house itself? It wasn't just some random hut. This was one of the largest houses in the entire settlement, and it was located right in the middle of everything. It even had its own granary, a place to store food. All the signs are pointing to this being the home of someone really, really important.
But the ultimate clue in any burial, is the skeleton itself. After 3,000 years, you have to wonder, what can a pile of bones really tell us? Well, as it turns out, a whole lot.
With modern science, we can look at a skeleton and start to build a profile. For example, by looking at the hip or pelvic area, which is usually larger in women, we can often figure out the sex of the individual. But what's really cool is that ancient science had its own totally fascinating ideas about the human body too.
Get this, about 2,000 years ago, there was this famous physician named Charaka. He wrote a groundbreaking book on medicine called the Charaka Samhita. And in it, he stated that the human body has 360 bones. Now, we know today it's 206. So why the difference? Well, Charaka was being super thorough. He was counting teeth, joints, and even cartilage in his final tally. Pretty amazing, right?
And it's not just about the skeletons. Archaeologists also study things like charred grains and animal bones that have cut marks on them. And from that, we can figure out what these people were eating. It turns out the people of Inamgan had a pretty diverse diet. We're talking wheat, barley, rice, all sorts of meats, and even fruits they gathered from the wild.
So what this tells us is that they were skilled at a bunch of different things. They were farmers, growing crops like wheat and barley. They were herders, raising cattle, goats, and sheep. And they were also foragers, who knew which wild fruits like burr, amla, and jamun were good to eat. They really built a rich and varied food supply from the world around them.
Which brings us right back to where we started, to our big mystery. Remember the Rigveda? The written record told us about these important warrior leaders called Rajas. And now look at the physical evidence from Inamgao. We have a man given a very special burial in a giant clay jar in the biggest house, right in the center of the settlement. Could this be one of those Rajas? Was this the body of a chief? All the clues are laid out for you. So, what do you think?
All right, let's jump right in. We're about to travel back in time, way back, like 3,500 years, to try and piece together the stories of some truly ancient peoples. We don't have their history books, right? But what we do have are the echoes they left behind, in their songs, in their tools, and even in their tomb.
So that's the big question, isn't it? How do we possibly reconstruct a world that existed so long ago, before writing was even a common thing? Well, we have to become detectives, basically, hunting for clues in some pretty unexpected places.
And here's what we've got to work with. On one side, we have these sacred hymns, actual words passed down through countless generations. And on the other side, we've got these silent, massive stone structures marking where people were buried. They're telling two very, very different parts of the same story.
So first up, let's try to listen to what these ancient people are actually saying. We're going to start with their words and try to decode the stories, the prayers, and the values that are all tucked away inside the Rigveda, which is one of the oldest collections of hymns anywhere in the world.
Check this out. This is a page from the Rigveda. Now, these hymns were first composed up in the northwest of the Indian subcontinent, and for centuries, they weren't written down at all. Nope, they were memorized perfectly and passed down orally from teacher to student. Just imagine a living, breathing library of sacred knowledge. Now, this is where it gets really cool. A single line of poetry like this just opens up an entire world. This hymn is actually a dialogue between a wise sage and two rivers, and it tells us exactly what mattered to these people. Did you catch it? Horses and cows. They weren't just animals to them. They were these powerful symbols of speed, wealth, and life itself.
And you see this theme everywhere in the Rigveda. Their prayers are for more cattle and more horses. The battles they fought, often using these amazing chariots, were all about getting more land for their animals to graze, securing water sources, and, sometimes for capturing people. This was a society where wealth was literally on the hoof.
So who was in charge of all this? Well, they had leaders they called Rajas. But, and this is a huge but, that word did not mean king the way you and I think of it today. Not even close.
And this chart just lays it all out perfectly. A Rigvedic Raja was a respected warrior who led his tribe into battle. They didn't live in giant palaces or capital cities. There wasn't a standing army, and they definitely weren't collecting taxes. You see, power wasn't something you inherited. It was something you earned by being a great leader, and crucially, by sharing the loot after a victory.
Okay, so the hymns paint a picture of this mobile, pastoral society. Now let's pivot and turn to our other set of clues, those silent stones. We're shifting from what people said to what they did. So what can these enormous burial sites tell us that the hymns can't?
I mean, look at these. They're called megaliths, which literally just means big stones. Pretty straightforward, right? Starting about 3,000 years ago, people all across the subcontinent started putting up these huge stone markers over graves. They're like these silent guardians, watching over the secrets of the dead.
And when archaeologists carefully dig these sites up, the stuff they find is just fascinating. You've got this very specific kind of pottery, beautiful gold and stone ornaments, even horse skeletons and gear, which sounds a little familiar, doesn't it? But then, they found something else, something that kind of flips the script. Tools and weapons made out of a totally new, much tougher metal.
Iron. Just let that sink in for a second. While all those hymns in the Rigveda are talking about a world of cattle and chariots, these silent tombs are showing us that a massive technological shift was already happening. People were being buried with iron.
Okay, so hold that thought about iron, because at the exact same time, thousands of miles away, a completely different kind of society was rising, with a totally different story to tell.
You see, to really get why this iron thing is such a big deal, we need to zoom out. So let's take a quick trip over to ancient China during the same period. We find another kind of writing there, but it was being used for a completely different reason.
So this is a whole different ballgame. This isn't a hymn meant for a whole community. This is an oracle bone. Think of it like a private hotline to the gods, used by a king. Around 3,500 years ago, the kings of the Shang dynasty in China used these to ask about, well, everything. Harvests, battles, the future of the kingdom, you name it.
And how they did this is just wild. A scribe would carve a question right onto the bone, like, will we win the next battle? Then they'd apply a hot poker to it, which would make the bone crack. A special fortune teller would then come in and read those crack patterns to figure out what the god's answer was. Incredible. So now we've got these two totally different pictures of what it meant to be a leader from the exact same time in history. Let's put them side by side and see just how different they really were.
I mean, just look at the difference here. It's night and day. The Rigvedic Rajas were these tribal leaders whose wealth was walking around on 4 legs. The Chinese kings? They were living in palaces inside walled cities, commanding huge armies and passing their power down to their sons. Their wealth wasn't in cattle, it was in stuff, really impressive stuff.
And that all leads us to the final piece of the puzzle, the big technological twist in our story. This is where it all comes together.
And here it is. This is the kicker. The Chinese kings, with their cities and their palaces, had absolutely mastered the art of making these enormous, stunningly beautiful bronze vessels. But, and the source material is super clear about this, they did not know how to use iron.
And that is the incredible paradox at the heart of our whole story. Over in China, you've got this super organized urban society defined by its mastery of bronze. And at the very same time, back in the Indian subcontinent, the people building those megalithic tombs are already using tools and weapons made of iron.
See, this is why looking at the past like a detective is so important. It completely messes with our simple ideas about what progress even means. So it leaves us with this one final fascinating question. What's more advanced? A society that makes these mind-blowing works of art for its kings, or a society that puts a new, stronger, more practical material into the hands of its people? The echoes from the past don't always give us easy answers.